Thanksgiving has always been my favorite holiday. It's a day where time slows down, where families gather, and the world feels just a little warmer. The smells of roasted turkey, fresh baked pies, and spiced cider fill the air. The sound of children laughing, dishes clinking, and voices raised in cheerful conversation echo through every home. For as long as I can remember, it's been a day for gratitude and connection, a day to be thankful for the things we take for granted. That's what I thought Thanksgiving was, what it always would be. But in 1983, everything I believed about that day changed forever. I was invited to the McAllister family farmhouse in Fallow Ridge, Pennsylvania, a beautiful old place nestled on the edge of town, surrounded by miles of dense forest and open fields. It was the kind of house you'd see in postcards. White clapboard siding, a wide front porch, smoke curling from the chimney. The McAllisters were well loved in the community, known for their generosity and hospitality. Their Thanksgiving feast was legendary, and that year, I was one of the lucky few who got an invitation. If you're a returning viewer, thank you so much for coming back. It means the world to me that you're here. And if this is your first time, welcome to the channel. I'd love to have you stick around, so feel free to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. That way, you won't miss any of the new stories we have coming your way. I remember walking up to the house, the ground crunching beneath my boots from the first frost of the season. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of food: turkey, stuffing, cranberry sauce, pies cooling on the windowsill. It was the kind of scene you'd expect to see in a Norman Rockwell painting. Warm, inviting, perfect. People were already gathered around the long dining table, laughing, sharing stories, toasting with glasses of wine. It felt like stepping into another world, one far removed from the worries of everyday life. At first, I was caught up in it all: the glow of the fireplace, the hum of conversation, the way the food seemed endless. It was everything Thanksgiving should be. But as the night went on, there was something I couldn't quite shake, a feeling I couldn't put into words. Maybe it was the way the wind outside seemed louder than usual, how it howled against the windows, like it was trying to get in. Maybe it was the way the shadows seemed to stretch further into the corners of the room as the candles burned lower. Or maybe it was just me, letting my imagination run wild. After all, what could possibly go wrong at a Thanksgiving dinner? If I had known then what I know now, I would have left before the first toast. I would have made any excuse to get up from that table and walk out the door. But I didn't. I stayed. I sat there, surrounded by faces I'd known for years, passing dishes and sharing laughter, completely unaware of what was about to unfold. I didn't know that by the end of the night, half of those faces would be gone. That the house, so full of life and warmth, would become a tomb, and that I would spend the rest of my life haunted by what happened there. You see, some memories are too heavy to carry, but they don't let you put them down. They cling to you, whispering in the dark, pulling you back to the moment they were born. I didn't just witness what happened that night. I lived it. And I wish I could tell you that what I saw and heard stayed in that house, but it didn't. The echoes of that night followed me. They still do. The McAllister farmhouse was alive that evening. It felt like the whole town was crammed into that house. Aunt Clara stood at the stove, her apron dusted with flour, directing traffic as dishes moved from the kitchen to the table. People were everywhere, pulling chairs closer to the table, balancing plates on their laps, sneaking tastes from the dessert tray before it was officially served. The walls seemed to hum with laughter and conversation. I found a seat near the middle of the table. Around me were neighbors I'd known for years. Uncle Ted with his booming voice, Cousin Sarah with her shy smile, and Mr. and Mrs. Coldwell, who always brought their famous pumpkin pie. Everyone was talking at once, their voices blending into a warm, familiar melody. The fireplace crackled in the background, adding its own rhythm to the evening. The food came out in waves, platters piled high with mashed potatoes, green beans, roasted carrots, and, of course, the turkey, a golden masterpiece that sat at the center of the table like a crown jewel. But the real star was the stuffing. Everyone knew Aunt Clara's stuffing was what made the McAllister Thanksgiving legendary. It was a recipe she guarded fiercely, passing it down to her daughters with whispered instructions, but never writing it down. People came from across town just to get a taste. When the dish was passed to me, I didn't think twice. I took a heaping spoonful, like I did with everything else. For a while, everything was perfect. Plates were filled and refilled. Glasses clinked as toasts were made. Uncle Ted told one of his stories, and even though I'd heard it a dozen times, it still made me laugh. Kids ran through the house, their giggles echoing up the staircase. The evening felt timeless, like it could go on forever. But then something shifted. It was subtle at first, so subtle that I didn't notice until much later. It started with Uncle Ted. He leaned back in his chair, his face a little flushed. Someone teased him about drinking too much, and he waved it off with a laugh, but his hand trembled as he reached for his glass. I remember thinking it was odd, but the moment passed, and the conversation moved on. Cousin Sarah was next. She said she felt lightheaded and excused herself to sit on the couch. Her mother followed her, fanning her face and asking if she'd eaten enough. More people began to complain. Small things at first, a headache, an upset stomach. I brushed it off, thinking maybe the rich food was catching up with us. After all, Thanksgiving was notorious for overindulgence. Then the first glass fell. It shattered against the floor, and the room went silent. It was Mrs. Caldwell. Her hand had gone limp and her eyes looked distant, like she wasn't fully there. Her husband shook her shoulder, calling her name, but she didn't respond. Someone yelled for water and chairs scraped against the floor as people rushed to help. That's when I felt it. The first twinge in my stomach. It was sharp, like a knife twisting just below my ribs. I looked around the table and I saw it on their faces. Confusion, fear. Whatever was happening, it wasn't just me. Half the guests were doubled over in pain, their faces pale and slick with sweat. Uncle Ted collapsed in the hallway on his way to the bathroom. Aunt Clara clutched her chest and fell to the floor, gasping for air. The scene unraveled so quickly, it felt like a dream, like watching something happen from a distance, even though I was right there in the middle of it. The children were crying, huddled together in the corner of the room. Someone tried to comfort them, but their own voice was shaking. The phone lines were down. The snowstorm that had started earlier in the day had knocked out the power, leaving us in flickering candlelight. The warmth that had filled the house just an hour ago was gone, replaced by something I couldn't explain. The air felt heavier, colder. Every breath seemed harder to take. And then there was the sound. It wasn't loud, just a soft creaking from upstairs, like someone walking across the old wooden floorboards. At first I thought it was one of the kids, but they were all accounted for. No one else was up there. I told myself it was nothing, just the wind, or the house settling in the cold. But deep down, I knew better. It didn't happen all at once. If it had, maybe we would have reacted sooner. But at first it was easy to dismiss. A headache here, a stomach cramp there. It was Thanksgiving after all. People were eating too much, drinking too much, laughing too hard. The kind of overindulgence that comes with the holiday. When Uncle Ted rubbed his temples and said, "I think I've had a little too much wine," no one thought much of it. Even when he pushed his chair back and stumbled toward the bathroom, I figured he just needed some air. But then Sarah spoke up. She said her chest felt tight, like she couldn't quite catch her breath. Her face was pale, almost gray. I watched as her mother guided her to the couch, fanning her with a napkin and whispering reassurances. Someone joked about holiday stress, but their voice lacked conviction. It was a thin attempt to keep the mood light, to pretend nothing was wrong, but the uneasy glances across the table told a different story. The first real sign of trouble came from Mrs. Caldwell. She was seated across from me, her plate still half full, when her fork clattered to the table. Her eyes rolled back and she slumped forward, her head landing on her folded arms. At first, we thought she'd fainted. Her husband shook her shoulder, calling her name, his voice rising with each attempt. When she didn't respond, the room fell silent, save for the crackling of the fire. All eyes were on her now, the cheerful conversations replaced by hushed murmurs of concern. Then it was chaos. People started dropping like dominoes. Cousin Peter ran to the bathroom holding his stomach, only to collapse in the hallway. Aunt Clara clutched her chest, her face twisted in pain as she stumbled backward, knocking over a chair before hitting the floor. Her gasps for air were sharp, desperate, and then nothing. The room erupted in screams. People shouted for water, for towels, for anything that might help, but nothing worked. My stomach twisted violently, a sharp, unbearable pain that nearly doubled me over. Someone finally remembered the phone, but it was useless. I heard the receiver click as they tried over and over, the monotone hum of a dead line cutting through the panic. We were miles from town, snow piling up outside, and no way to reach anyone for help. Someone else grabbed their coat, yelling that they'd drive to the nearest hospital, but they didn't make it past the front door. The snowstorm had come fast and heavy, blocking the roads with thick drifts of white. We were trapped. I remember gripping the edge of the table, staring at the scene around me, unable to move. Plates of untouched food sat abandoned. Chairs were overturned, wine glasses shattered on the floor. People were on their knees, clutching their stomachs, or clutching their stomachs, or hunched over the couch. The laughter and warmth that had filled the room earlier were gone, replaced by cries of pain and confusion. The air felt colder now, almost suffocating, like something unseen was pressing down on us. And then there was that sound again, the faint creak of footsteps above us, slow and deliberate. No one else seemed to notice, too consumed by their own suffering. But I heard it clear as day. Each step sent a chill down my spine, as if whoever, or whatever, was up there, was waiting for something, waiting for us. By now, the dining room looked nothing like it had just an hour earlier. Half the chairs were empty, their former occupants now sprawled on the floor or slumped against the walls. Others were still seated, heads tilted back, eyes closed, their faces drained of color. Some tried to make it out of the room, only to collapse before they reached the doorway. The smell of food still hung in the air, but it had changed. It was no longer appetizing. It had turned sour, blending with something sharp and metallic. Every breath I took felt heavier, like it carried the weight of something I couldn't see. I stayed in my chair, frozen. Around me, the survivors, if that's what we were, began to drift toward the living room. No one said a word. There was no shouting now, just low sobs and shallow, labored breaths. We sat there together, staring at one another, waiting for something. The fear wasn't just in our faces, it was in the air, thick and suffocating. I remember the silence the most. That awful silence, broken only by the occasional sound of someone shifting uncomfortably or the crackle of the dying fire. It felt like the house itself had turned against us, like it was no longer just walls and windows, but something alive, watching, keeping us there. I tried to shake the thought, but I couldn't. Each breath I took tasted wrong, heavy, as if even the air had been poisoned. My stomach churned, not just from the food, but from the growing realization that there was no help coming. We were on our own. Then Sarah spoke. Her voice was barely a whisper, so quiet that I almost didn't hear it over the pounding of my own heartbeat. "It's the food," she said. Her words hung in the air like a weight, sinking into all of us. At first, I didn't understand, but then I remembered. The stuffing. Aunt Clara's prized recipe. Everyone had eaten it, but the ones who took the largest portions were the ones suffering the most. I looked down at my own plate, the remnants of stuffing smeared across the edge, and my stomach turned again. I wanted to say something to confirm what Sarah had said, but before I could, I heard it again, the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from above us. My eyes darted to the ceiling and I saw others doing the same. No one had gone upstairs. We were all in the living room, or the dining room. The footsteps moved across the ceiling, pausing just above where we sat. My heart felt like it was trying to claw its way out of my chest. Then the chair moved. It was one of the dining chairs, the kind with a high back and wooden legs. It slid backward on its own, scraping against the floor with a sound that made everyone flinch. No one was near it. It just moved, as if someone invisible had pushed it away from the table. Someone screamed. Others gasped. My mind raced to make sense of it, to find a logical explanation, but there wasn't one. The room erupted into chaos again, people shouting, crying, clutching one another like it would make a difference. I wanted to believe it wasn't real, that we were imagining things, that the stress and the sickness were playing tricks on our minds, but the chair was still there, out of place, a physical reminder that whatever was happening wasn't just in our heads. The footsteps stopped, but the silence that followed was worse. It felt like the house was holding its breath, waiting, just like we were. I looked at Sarah, her face pale and drawn. She was staring at the chair too, her lips moving as if she were praying. But no prayer could fix this. Whatever had started when we sat down at that table was still unfolding, and I knew we hadn't seen the worst of it yet. Morning came slowly, though none of us had slept. The snowstorm had passed, leaving the world outside blanketed in pristine white. From the living room, I could see sunlight filtering through the frost-covered windows. It should have felt hopeful, but it didn't. The light only made everything worse. It revealed the full scope of what had happened. The overturned chairs, the shattered glasses, the bodies. The silence was unbearable, heavier than any sound could have been. The first sign of life came from the driveway. A car engine sputtered in the cold, and then I heard boots crunching through the snow. It was Mr. Latham, a neighbor from down the road. He knocked on the door, the sound echoing through the house like a gunshot. When no one answered, he let himself in, calling out the McAllisters' names. I wanted to get up, to tell him what had happened, but my body wouldn't move. I just sat there, staring, my breath visible in the cold morning air. When he stepped into the living room, his face turned pale. He froze for a moment, taking it all in. The bodies, the survivors huddled together, too stunned to speak. "Dear God," he muttered under his breath, reaching for the phone on the wall, but the line was still dead. He ran back to his car, promising he'd send help, and for the first time since the night began, I felt a flicker of relief. Someone else knew. We weren't alone anymore. It didn't take long for the authorities to arrive. The paramedics moved quickly, though there wasn't much they could do. They checked pulses, called out times of death, and wrapped the bodies in blankets. The rest of us, those of us who had survived, were ushered outside, where we were wrapped in coats and given water. No one asked questions at first. They just kept repeating that we were safe now. But I didn't feel safe. Not there, not in that house. The investigation began almost immediately. They took samples of the food, examined the kitchen, and interviewed the survivors. It didn't take long for them to find the source. It was the stuffing. More specifically, it was the mushrooms Aunt Clara had used. They'd been canned years ago, stored away in the back of the pantry, forgotten until that Thanksgiving morning. Somehow, they'd gone rancid, developing a rare strain of Clostridium botulinum. It spread through the stuffing like poison, and once it was in our systems, there was no stopping it. The explanation should have brought closure, but it didn't. It felt too simple, too clinical. The mushrooms might explain the sickness, but they didn't explain the rest. The phone line going dead, the snowstorm arriving out of nowhere, the footsteps. And then there were the whispers, the things the other survivors claimed to have seen. One of them swore they'd seen Aunt Clara standing in the hallway after she'd collapsed. Another said they heard her humming, the same tune she always hummed when she cooked. I didn't want to believe it, but I couldn't ignore the look in their eyes. They weren't lying. I stayed quiet about what I'd heard, about the chair moving on its own, about the feeling that the house itself was alive. I told myself it was just the stress, the sickness, the trauma. But even now, all these years later, I can't shake the memory. Every creak in my house, every gust of wind against the windows brings me back to that night, to that house, to the sounds and the smells and the things I can't explain. I still can't eat Thanksgiving dinner without hearing the echoes of that night. Every bite tastes wrong, every moment feels fragile, like it could all collapse again. And sometimes late at night when the house is quiet, I hear it, faint footsteps above me, slow and deliberate, as if Aunt Clara is still searching, still wandering, still guarding her secret recipe, a feast that turned fatal. Thank you for joining me tonight, for listening to this story. It's one I've carried with me for decades, and though sharing it doesn't make it easier, it feels like something you needed to hear. As you sit down for your next family feast, take a moment to think about the hands that prepared it, the traditions that fill your table. How safe is your family gathering? And what if the ghosts of Thanksgiving past aren't as far away as we like to think? If you want more stories like this, real chilling tales that stay with you, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. Until next time, take care of yourselves and each other.